The dawn broke over the desert like a silent burst of fire, its colors reflecting off the dust-choked horizon as if the earth itself was trying to reveal a hidden truth. Amid the winds that carried the scent of metal and burnt earth, a single figure moved through the wreckage with a quiet intensity that made even the hardened soldiers glance twice before returning to their duties. No one knew her story. No one understood the weight she carried. To most who saw her, she was just another medic, one who happened to keep her head down, her emotions tucked behind calm, disciplined eyes, and her uniform strangely plain except for one small, neatly pinned detail she never spoke about. She was just a medic, they all thought, until the day the firefight roared through the valley and the silence of her past cracked open to Camp Solara. The young soldiers often whispered about her in hushed tones. They called her Sister Noor because she had a kind of radiance that didn't come from charm or beauty, but from an unspoken resilience in the way she walked among the wounded. Noor had a quiet presence that seemed to slow panic and steady trembling hands. She worked without complaint, carrying stretchers, applying tourniquets, stitching torn flesh with hands that never once faltered. Her uniform remained clean even on the worst days, not because she avoided the chaos, but because she seemed to move through it with a strange, almost impossible composure. But beneath that calm, Noor held memories sharper than the scalpels she carried. Memories she never planned to reopen. The camp was always alive with noise. Engines rattling, radios cracking, orders being shouted over the drone of aircraft. But for Noor, it all faded into a distant hum each time she knelt beside a wounded soldier. In those moments, the world narrowed to a pulse, a breath, a heartbeat she refused to let slip away. She had saved dozens, maybe hundreds, but she kept no tally. Numbers never mattered to her. Only the faces did. And it was the faces from years ago, the ones she could not save, that haunted her more than the screams of any new casualty. Long before she arrived in this sun-blasted outpost, Noor had been part of a convoy deep in the mountains where the cliffs cut the sky into jagged pieces. She wasn't merely a medic then. She served as a field leader in a crisis that was never publicly acknowledged. Her team of rescue specialists had been ambushed, pinned against a collapsing ridge. Noor remembered every detail: the whistling descent of shells, the suffocating dust, the panic of the trapped, and the terrible moment when the cliff gave way. 15 soldiers survived that disaster, but not because of luck. They survived because Noor had refused to abandon them even as the cliff crumbled under her feet. She dragged men twice her weight, shielded others with her own body, and held the line until reinforcements arrived. But she paid a heavy cost. The final explosion took her commander's life, a man who had believed in her, mentored her, and treated her like a younger sister. She held him as he faded, and his last words carved themselves into her soul. Noor left that valley with a limp she learned to hide, a heart with a scar no medic could stitch, and a medal placed quietly in her palm by a grieving general who told her she had changed the meaning of bravery. But medals could not resurrect the dead, so she tucked it away, buried her past, and volunteered for the most remote medical deployments she could find. She did not seek recognition. She did not want her story told. She only wanted to serve, to save who she could, and to silence the ghosts that walked beside her, that might have remained her truth forever. If not for the day the valley erupted, that it began with a radio transmission filled with static and fear. A convoy heading toward Camp Solara had been ambushed, and the enemy had the high ground. The terrain was a maze of rocky ridges and narrow ravines, perfect for trapping everyone inside. The young soldiers rushed to gear up, many of them trembling as the thunder of artillery echoed in the distance. Noor stood among them, steady but quiet, as she assembled her medical bag. She could feel something familiar in the air, the same tension, the same smell of earth and shrapnel that had followed her years ago. She hoped she was wrong. But when the first wave of casualties was brought in, blood pouring into the sand, she knew she was not. The wounded came in faster than the stretchers could return. Shouts filled the air as men carried their brothers in arms, desperately trying to get them to Noor's hands. She moved quickly, efficiently, refusing to let her mind drift to the past. But the battlefield outside was spiraling into chaos, and soon the camp itself began taking fire. The ground shook violently, dust falling from tent poles as Noor leaned over a soldier whose chest would not rise. Her eyes sharpened. She locked her hands and breathed for him until he finally gasped through the pain. She saved him, then another, then another. Even as the explosions drew closer, the problem was clear. A group of soldiers were trapped between ridges, cut off, running low on ammunition, and taking heavy fire. Reinforcements were delayed by the terrain. Every minute lost was a death sentence. The commanding officer, a stern yet shaken man who had only recently arrived, stared at the tactical map with frustration tightening his jaw. They needed someone who could lead a rescue team through the narrow pass, a route too dangerous for most, with visibility too low for drones. Volunteers hesitated. The last unit that went in barely made it back. Then the officer heard a calm, steady voice behind him. It was Noor, standing quietly with her medic bag slung over her shoulder. What followed was something the younger soldiers would recount for years, though Noor herself would never repeat it. She led a small team through the dust storms, ducking sniper fire with uncanny awareness, moving through the maze of jagged rocks as if she had walked that terrain 100 times before. She kept the soldiers close, guiding them with precise hand signals, moving them from cover to cover until they finally reached the trapped troops. The sight that greeted them was horrific. Bodies lay motionless, some moaning weakly for help, others too far gone. Noor's heart threatened to pull her back into the memories she had spent years trying to bury. But she did what she always did. She knelt, she breathed, she worked. Her hands flew with practiced speed, patching wounds, stabilizing critical injuries, and urging the surviving soldiers to keep fighting for every breath. That a sudden roar exploded nearby, shattering the rocks and sending shrapnel into her leg. Pain seared through her, but she did not stop. When another blast pinned 2 soldiers under debris, she forced herself forward, using every ounce of strength to tear away the rubble. Her hands bled, her muscles shook, and the valley echoed with the violence of the ongoing assault. But Noor refused to fall. By the time reinforcements arrived, she had saved more men in those impossible minutes than seemed humanly doable. The survivors looked at her through tears of disbelief, not because she was a medic who had helped them, but because she had seemed to carry them all on her shoulders through a storm that should have crushed them. When the convoy finally returned to Camp Solara, the exhausted soldiers stumbled from the vehicles, covered in dust, sweat, and blood. And in the middle of them walked Noor, her left leg dragging slightly behind her, her uniform ripped, her hands trembling from exhaustion she was trying to hide. But tucked on her chest, revealed only because half her uniform had been torn open by shrapnel, was the medal. The young soldiers froze. The commanding officer's breath caught. The entire camp went silent as the light glinted off the decoration pinned to her chest. A medal only given to those whose actions went beyond heroism, something almost whispered about in military circles, but rarely ever seen in person. Noor hadn't worn it for recognition. She had worn it simply because it was the only thing she kept from her past deployment, a reminder of the commander who died believing in her point. One by one, every soldier in the camp straightened their posture. Men too wounded to stand pushed themselves upright. Others lowered their heads with respect normally reserved for legends. They realized then that Noor wasn't just a medic. She wasn't just someone who patched wounds and whispered comfort into fading ears. She was a soldier who had walked through hell once before and still chose to walk through it again for them. The commanding officer stepped forward, his eyes shining not with authority, but with reverence. And though Noor tried to downplay everything, tried to shift attention back to the wounded, the truth could no longer be hidden. She had carried the camp that day. She had changed what courage meant to the soldiers who had witnessed her strength.